So Okay, welcome back from your lunch and from those really fantastic student presentations outside, which I saw all of you clustered around, including one set of presentations that lead nicely and naturally into our final panel on empowering displaced communities through language and culture. And for this, I want to turn over to my colleague, Jennifer Goodlander, who directs our Southeast Asia Studies program at the Hamilton Luger School, and who's also an associate professor of comparative literature, to talk more about cultural and linguistic preservation among migrant communities. Jennifer.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This has been a really interesting conference so far, and I'm really excited that we're able to contribute to it. One of my visions for the Southeast Asian and ASEAN Studies program is not only to encourage research and classes and learning about Southeast Asia, but to connect with the Southeast Asian communities around us as well. And this panel is a part of doing that. So I want to ask the panelists, we're going to start with each of them giving an introduction of who they are and talking a little bit about their work for some context.
Okay, I will begin. My name is Kelly Harper-Berkson. I'm faculty in linguistics here at IU. I'm the co-director of the Center for Refugee Studies and the director of the Chin Languages Research Project. So I'm going to tell you two things, and then we can circle back to them. First, I want to tell you what linguistics is. We have heard in various ways over the course of the last 2 days about the fact that language is at the heart of a lot of the issues that we're talking about. Linguistics is the scientific study of human language, and we study all sorts of aspects of language, so speech sounds or certain constructions or how language is used in identity building, etc. And what I will say is that I think having access to your mother tongue is a basic human right. And we linguists haven't done a very good PR job in terms of teaching the world that language is actually additive. The more languages you speak, the better off you are. Multilingualism is the normal state of being. We don't have to make a choice. We can support learning new languages and also maintaining and strengthening our heritage languages. That's just true. Okay, so policy-wise, I'm not a policymaker. I don't know how to do that. But cognitively, we are all better off when we have more than one language. So I run the Chin Languages Research Project. Indiana is home to about 40,000 Burmese refugees who hail mainly from Chin State in Western Burma. Chin State is extremely multilingual, so there are at least 50 languages and distinct cultural traditions that exist in Chin State, and those now are also present here in Indiana. It's extremely common for people in the Chin community of Indiana to be highly multilingual, speaking 3, 4, 5, 6, as many as 10 languages. And we have lots of Chin students on campus, so hopefully you all got to meet a bunch of our team members at the posters just a moment ago. The Chin Languages Research Project does scholarship and documentation on languages. We work in linguistic documentation, but we also work really closely with students to equip them with the skills and the confidence that will let them participate in venues like this. And I think that, in academia, we say a lot of the time that we want to diversify the academy, that everyone deserves a seat at the table, but the table wasn't built for everyone. And so the CLRP works really hard to help make the academy feel like a safer space, like a place where people who aren't necessarily familiar with the ways that things work in the academy can become comfortable, can become familiar, and hopefully take my place on this stage at the next iteration of this symposium.
Great. I'm John Kay. I'm an associate professor of folklore, and I'm not a linguist. Makes me distinct here. In fact, my area of specialty in folklore is I'm a scholar of Indiana. I study this place. I'm what you would call the state folklorist. For the past 20 years, I've worked to identify, document, and promote the folk and traditional arts of the state of Indiana. So that means I go down and work with 4th and 5th generation hoop net makers down on the White River and the Wabash River. That means I work with ballet folklorico dancers up in East Chicago. That means I work with glass artists in Elwood that go back generations. I'm working with all different types of musicians and craftspeople all around the state of Indiana. Some of those are indigenous traditions, like the Miami, who still make elm bark baskets up in northeast Indiana, or the Potawatomi, who make black ash baskets up in the South Bend area. But a few years ago, I discovered that there were basket makers in Indianapolis, and they were making traditional chin baskets. And I've studied baskets all over, pine needle baskets and sweetgrass baskets along the Atlantic coast, down the southern part of the state. I've worked with indigenous basket makers in northern Indiana, white oak basket makers in Appalachia, bamboo basket makers in Guangxi, China, all types of basket makers. And then I get to sit across from these men because Kelly introduced me to her students, and her students introduced me to them. And I discovered these two men, Nai Chum and Cheole, and they were making these incredible baskets like this one right here. And you probably can't tell what that's made out of, but in the warehouses where many of their family members work, there's this plastic strapping that they use to make, to tie down pallets and the like. And they've started making all of these different types of traditional baskets. And I found out through talking with them and a few other people that there are these kind of two traditional arts that are really highly prized in that community. One is basketry. Go to a performance or something like that, you'll see baskets decorating the stage, kind of symbolic meaning that's been attached to those. And the other is backstrap weaving. And so we did a project working with raise your hand, to start this program called Winding Wednesday, which was helping younger Chin women learn traditional weaving from older Chin women, and then it turned into all types of handicrafts and foodways, and it was going to be like once a month, and it turned out to be every week. We then were able to get weavers into our apprenticeship program. Then we started working with Reverend Hle and Naichum and doing classes for students with basket making, and it was really felt like I was doing some of the most important work of my career, because there was this disconnect between the traditional knowledge of the elders and the younger people, and there was this need to try to bring these two things together. Now, for many folklorists, we would have this conversation that this is important because it's heritage, because it's old. This is part of our culture. It's significant. You get these things thrown around. But I want to add one more thing to this. This makes us human. These types of everyday creative practices, these things that connect us with communities, these things that give us senses of purpose, this is the power of the folk and traditional arts, is that they help us feel connected. It gives us meaning. It feels like we have a reason to be here. Now, you think about here among most of the Western, you'd say Indiana, mainstream culture, you might call it, we have an epidemic among older adults of isolation, boredom, helplessness. All of the traditional arts, whether you're from Indiana originally and your family have been here for generations, or you're newcomers, if you practice these traditional arts, you have this kind of culturally proven strategy for resisting feelings of boredom, feelings of isolation, feelings of disconnection and helplessness. And so that's the point for the work that I'm trying to do, is the fact that we don't just need these because it's old traditions. We need these because it connects us and gives us purpose and meaning. So.
Thanks, John. My name is Michal Temkin-Martinez. I am a professor of linguistics at Boise State University. This is my 16th year there. And my original training is actually similar to Kelly's in that I was trained in theoretical and experimental approaches to linguistics, all work that can be done in front of a computer with a couple of books and some articles. And the experimental stuff required some people. But I always sort of saw it as a means to an end. As a grad student, I sort of thought, I knew I wanted to be a professor. I knew I had to get the PhD. This was the thing I could do because there was nothing else at my institution. But once I interviewed at Boise State, I learned that Boise is a resettlement city. And when I looked into what that means, I saw that the only linguistic diversity really that we have outside of Spanish speakers in the state of Idaho came from the local population of New Americans or resettled refugees. And I immediately thought, okay, I'm gonna change my research trajectory to really be place-based, if I get hired here, of course. This is during my interview stage. I really wanted to change my research and was thinking, how do I adapt it to this place? And I thought, well, I can help document the languages spoken by those who were resettled in Boise. And naively, I thought, as soon as I got hired, that I would just contact people and they would be so excited to have the languages documented. And I learned very quickly that, like many other vulnerable populations, our resettled refugee communities were over-researched and underserved. And they didn't want another white lady coming in and saying, I can help you with this thing that you don't care about. And so I was very rightfully ignored for the first 6 months that I was there, and I pretty much let go of the idea of working with the communities unless an opportunity came about. And in fact, one did. My second semester at Boise State, I was looking for lab space for my lab, and our vice provost, our nursing department had just gotten a brand new, beautiful building with room for growth in it. And so our vice provost said, I can get you in that building. And he thought I was already doing research with refugees, so he went to the chair of nursing and said, I have this linguist, she works with refugees, can she have some space in your building? And she said, oh, that's perfect, because we also work with refugees. And at the time, the School of Nursing was doing several studies on health disparities within resettled refugee communities, but also on the gaps between the actual health of resettled refugees and their perceived health. They found that there was actually a really big gap between what people actually had and what they thought they had because of the way that the community behaved back home and just communal sharing of everything. People were sharing medicine when they didn't really have, like people were sharing insulin when they didn't have diabetes. People are taking other people's heart medications. So very important things to actually get everybody on track to leading a healthy life. And while they were doing these studies, they were working with 5 different communities who had originally come from different parts of Africa. And there were 3 communities, 7 languages involved. And they were working with interpreters who weren't trained interpreters, but knew how to work within a medical setting, but didn't know interpreting in research settings, right? So when you do a research project, there are very specific questions in protocols, and they had to be followed precisely. And so the chair of nursing was thrilled to have me around to train the interpreters, which, by the way, is not what linguists are trained to do. But I immediately said, I'll do it. And I figured out how to. And I worked with them, and with what little knowledge I knew about interpretation, what I knew about was language awareness and about human interactions and communication and things like that. And so I was really able to contribute to that. And in addition to that, I got some space for my lab. And they brought me onto the project. And so my students and I were on site for the project. We helped with all sorts of conceptual projects, and we also helped with carrying out the project. And as soon as the leaders of the different communities met me and learned that I was a linguist, they asked for help with English language support, right? So helping their children and also their elders with English language support. And I'm in a department, I was then in an English department, but we had applied linguists who specialize in second language acquisition and in helping to, in good methodology for teaching English. And so I was able to connect them with that support, because if there's something I know less than interpreting, it's how to teach languages. And so it was a good thing to connect them with other experts. And then when I had mentioned to them my idea of documenting the languages, they said, it would be amazing to be able to document our languages because our children are not speaking our languages and they're not able to communicate to their grandparents who are in the same household as them. And our sense is that in one more generation, there's going to be very little understanding of our culture and of our language. And for some of our community members, there is nobody left back home, right? So the language is not spoken in their homeland. And so all of the speakers are in the diaspora, and they're slowly noticing the attrition of their own language. And for many of them, while they were in the refugee camp, they learned several other languages. The speakers that I worked with from Africa all spoke Swahili, and in the homes spoke Swahili as well, so that their children could hang out with all of the other children who had come from Africa. And so they weren't actually seeing the value of teaching their children their language. But then the older generation might not speak Swahili and might have communication issues with their grandchildren. And so they realized that there's some value to it. And so that ended up being sort of my inroad to working with them. The work that I do is that I devised a capstone project for our students in linguistics that is what we call field methods, which is our students sit with a language expert, a speaker of a language that they are not familiar with, and they slowly figure out things about the language by asking questions and asking for sentences and things like that. And they slowly form an understanding of the language. And inevitably, at the same time, they're learning about the culture and they're learning about language-adjacent issues. And in our case, working with resettled refugees, they're also learning about resettlement. They're learning about some of the issues that our community members were facing. And the way that I approach the community about this, first of all, I've always worked with communities, large communities that are self-organized, that have nonprofit organizations. And I was always able to reach out to community leadership to ask for permission to work on their language. Now, of course, as soon as we worked with one language, we started getting connected to other communities saying, oh, you need to work on our language next, right? There was sort of a competition between the communities. But we always work with leadership to ask for permission and to also ask to identify a speaker. And somebody who is respected by the community for their knowledge of their language and whose English is fluent enough for us to be able to communicate. And then we also asked the community about what projects they might be interested in working on for their own language. So for example, one community that I've worked with spoke a dialect or a variety of a language that had diverged from, the language was originally spoken in Tanzania, and they were taken to Somalia as slaves and had been there for over a century, and their language diverged from the original dialect. There was no dictionary for their language, and the dictionary that was made for the Tanzanian variety was of no help to them, and so they wanted a bilingual dictionary. Another community had a very rich set of proverbs, like over 300 proverbs, and they had a community member who was an expert on proverbs, and so they wanted their proverbs documented. So we really work with community members to determine who works with us, and to also determine what we work on so that it's not just about my students benefiting from having access to a speaker, to a consultant, but rather there's mutual benefits to both the community and to us. Importantly, to train our students in figuring out how to be contributing members to their community and how to help with the skills that they've learned as linguists, how to be of help to all community members. You're next, Ken.
Excuse me, I'm testing. All right, I'm Ken van Beek. If you think that I'm a Dutch, I'm not. Van means heaven. Beek means superlative marker, so I just came down from heaven, according to my name. I'm a faculty member at Cal State Fullerton in the Department of English, Comparative Literature and Linguistics, and I'm in the linguistic part. My journey to this is very long. It could take 2 days, but I studied physics in my undergrad, and on my way to become linguist, I studied theology, so my name is really appropriate. God did not like what I said.
Yeah. Wait, the battery's here. Yes.
Ken, we can hand you.
It might wake up some students, so that's a good thing.
Take the mic.
All right, so much for drama. I'm the end part, so where were I? Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the Global and Area Perspective 2024 Symposium on Migration. And I feel very honored that I'm a part of this symposium. I'm going to talk about my life because I think my life is relevant as an immigrant to this country, as this is a symposium on migration. So I grew up in Hakka, Chin State, and I went to Yangon University for my undergrad. And I came to the US when I was 26. And after 20 years, amazingly, I earned a PhD in linguistics from UC Berkeley. As a linguist, I work to document and celebrate Chin languages. There are many Chin languages actually spoken now in the US, as Professor Bergson indicated. And here in Indianapolis, rightfully called as Chindianapolis sometimes. So I consider myself as a bridge between Chin communities and mainstream American culture, especially so that the Chin immigrants could integrate into the mainstream, American culture, and they could become well connected. So I'm sure you are aware that that kind of effort involves helping American educators and social workers to help the Chin communities in this, their integration effort. So my main effort has been to work with educators like university professors, including IU professors, so that our Chin students could come to these great universities and also become responsible citizens where they live. I also work with social workers And I sometimes work with courts for some Chin criminals, unfortunately. I hope that I could inspire my Chin youths to become educated Chin American who bridge the Chin communities with mainstream American. One of my proudest moments was when I wrote a letter of recommendation for Miss Suinhempar, who you saw her poster presentation for a PhD program here in IU. And she's a PhD candidate now. I think she would be the first Chin woman who would, I don't know other Chin women, but so be a PhD. We are very proud that I hope that many other Chin and Burmese will continue her footsteps. And I also hope that these youths can bridge these Chin communities back to the Chin communities across, back to Burma and also across the world. Thank you so much.
So now I'm going to ask, Michal, if you can define resettlement and maybe give a little bit of context of what that process is like in the United States.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Jennifer. And as we were preparing for the panel, looking at the other panels that were presented before us, we were thinking that it would be really helpful to understand the resettlement process in the U.S. Context and to understand what it's like for newly resettled refugees once they're here. In the U.S., first of all, historically, the U.S. has resettled about 0.5% of the world's refugees, right? 0.5%, which is not a huge number, and is something that we, working in the academic context in our communities, when there are complaints that there are too many refugees in our cities, I like to bring up that statistic. It's just a really, really, really tiny, tiny sliver of that number that we got yesterday from Tariq, the 120, almost 120 million people who've been displaced, right? And the way that, the US has mandated for every single state to have at least one resettlement city. So every state is mandated to be welcoming new resettled refugees. But the way that the state manages the resettlement is up to the state. They can either do it through an office within their government structure, or they can sort of farm it out to NGOs or to nonprofit organizations. And the way that, what all of them have in common is that once you are resettled as a refugee, you receive 8 months of subsidies. And during those 8 months, if you are of working age, so between the ages of 18 and 65, it is mandatory for you to go to intensive language classes to learn English, to be proficient enough to be financially independent. The main focus of those classes is to get you to a level of proficiency that could lead to financial independence. And financial independence is more or less defined as you are offered a job and you take the job, and that job will provide you with enough funding to not have to live on government subsidies. Now, the trick to this is that if you are offered a job for which you have enough language proficiency, you must take that job, even if it's within the 8 months. So an example of this is one of our collaborators in one of our projects was a neurosurgeon back home in the Democratic Republic of Congo and arrived in the US having a fairly rich vocabulary in English and fairly proficient in English in general. And so he was able to get a job immediately as a custodian, right? But the agreement is you are resettled, and if you are resettled, you must take a job as soon as you are offered the job. And so he wasn't able to complete his studies of English to become advanced enough to maybe get into a PA program or another sort of professional program that can help him train to go back into practicing some form of medicine, not necessarily as a doctor, but in the healthcare system. And this varies pretty widely among the different people who arrive. But again, the main stated goal of the program is to get folks to be financially independent. But if they're taking those first jobs that are offered to them, they're often making minimum wage or close to minimum wage without a federal minimum wage that is a living wage in most of our states. That makes the situation pretty tricky, and it makes it so that they are still financially dependent on state subsidies, even if they're working full-time, in many cases. Importantly, the goal of the intensive English program is not to lead adults of working age into higher education, right? It is absolutely not in the mandate. It is not at all one of the goals of this. And one of the things that my colleagues and I have really tried to advocate for is a way for our university to become more aware of our community members and their needs and their interests in pursuing higher education. Many of them had some degrees, some of them had some education that was interrupted by the crises that led to their fleeing. And so being able to, as an academic, to connect our community members with their interests has been a goal of my colleagues and I. Finally, I'll just mention one quick thing. So that's the main thing with resettlement. One thing about linguistics with resettlement is that often the discrimination and the violence that our resettled refugees have experienced is also targeted at their language. And so that leads to language endangerment issues with many of our refugees who arrived and who speak languages that were already minoritized in their home countries. Yeah.
Great, thanks. There we go, thank you. So next, Kelly, I was gonna have you talk about, in that context, about the role of language and culture work within the resettlement process.
Oh,
And
so
the work that the...
no big question there. I'm going to ask you and Ken to jump in too on this. That's too big. That's really big. So I guess that what I'll say is that I'm at a university, and so I primarily work with students. And the Chin community in Indianapolis has been established for several decades at this point, and there is a lot of work that's going on in the community to send students to university. So there are a lot of Chin community organizations advocating for higher education and the attainment of higher education. And yet Sui is our first Chin PhD student. I didn't prep her that we were going to put her on the spot. And we have another graduate student who started last year as well. So what they're doing by being here and pursuing higher education is they're increasing the permission structure. They are showing their younger siblings and their friends that you can, in fact, you can stay at IU past the undergraduate degree and do a graduate degree. And I'm not sure if this is what you meant to be asking me, but it's how I'm going to take the question. So there are all sorts of precious elements of cultural heritage that I don't have the right to say what matters and what doesn't, and it's not my role to determine what should happen. It is community members' job to do that, but I'm at a university and I have a certain set of skills, and I also have access to resources, and I have a comfort level with going to administrators and asking for help with things. And so I really think that in terms of interfacing between the university, the community, linguistic and cultural heritage, we are essentially well-trained, and we have toolboxes with tools in them that can be used to help protect language, culture, basketry traditions, et cetera. What we can do is develop close, authentic, reciprocal working relationships with students so that they develop a level of comfort that will let them say, this is something that's really important that we should be working on. So, you know, we may be the ones who write the grant proposals and get the money to make the work happen, but if we're the ones determining what the project is going to be, I think we're doing it wrong. Like, it shouldn't be that way. It should be that we have really close working relationships with students who are community members and who can go to their elders and who can be the ones who say, this is the thing that we should pursue. And so I think John actually already referenced this. You know, well, you happened to be obsessed with baskets.
I was.
Yeah. Before, I've never thought about textiles before in my life. I've never thought about weaving. I didn't know what a backstrap loom was, but I'll tell you what, I've become obsessed with it. And it's not, it's because that is what people regularly talk to me about. Yeah.
Can I modify one thing?
Please do.
I think sometimes when we come from the university, we rightfully say we need to talk to the community about what they want, what they value, what they want to do. But we also have to remind ourselves that sometimes people don't know what can be done, what the options even are. And so one of the things, because we do have skills and we do have toolkits and models that we can say, we find out what people are interested in, and then we kind of share some of those models. Well, you know, this community, they did this type of thing. And you know, this group over here, they started a nonprofit because the churches weren't necessarily working for them in this way here. And we just started building out some other skills that weren't just waiting for them to give us, they needed to tell us exactly what they wanted to do. So we were able to actually leverage our experiences, but always in dialogue with the communities.
Yes, thank you. And that does answer the question I had. I was talking with the panelists earlier. One of the things I was really struck by as they talk about their work that seems very different is we often talk about migration as a problem and a solution, but that it's actually much more dialogic than that and much more nuanced than that is perhaps not the helpful way to frame things. And I know in our conversation as well, John, you had mentioned the difference between conservation and preservation as well. And I know we're getting very close to the time that we want to open it up to your questions, but I wanted to ask my panelists first if there are other reflections that you haven't gotten to share, especially about how the university can, should, is working with refugee populations.
Yeah, I can start us off on that. I think one of the most important things for me was that I came into a university that already had established relationships with the resettlement communities. So our service learning projects and our service learning center on campus already had established relationships with the folks who were actually in charge of resettling. And so students were already taking the information and the knowledge that they were gaining and the skills that they were gaining in their classes and going into the community and serving as volunteers in very specific roles that were established by the resettlement agencies. And then folks like the School of Nursing, who was working with the community on community-based research projects, were out in the community working with the nonprofits that were established by the resettled refugee communities. And what was really helpful was to step into that as an academic, as a new person in town as an academic, to step into those networks very cautiously and very humbly and very respectfully, understanding that trust, we've heard the theme of trust these last 2 days, but the trust that was established between different entities at the university and members of our community would not be broken because an ignorant linguist showed up and wanted to just do language documentation projects, right? So I was brought in very willingly by the School of Nursing, but I also very intentionally approached it as humbly as possible so that I wasn't the reason that connections were severed and trust was broken by community members. But another thing that we have as academics is not just the networks that are local to us, right? It's the networks that we have in our disciplines. It's the networks that we have as very long-time academics, right? By the time we graduate with our PhDs, we have been at multiple institutions. We have met different people who have different connections at different institutions, and all of us have resources. And to be able to leverage those networks and those resources to aid the local community in your, that surrounds your university, I think is really critical. I think that can be one of our most important charges as academics. And so I really value the networks that I have of linguists around the world who are doing really important work and who can help come up with solutions for, not necessarily solutions, but with resources for our community members who are interested in doing certain things and the needs that are in our community.
Yes, as a complement to that, Ken, we had talked about the work you do as a bridge and the need and the work you do as a translator. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that because I think that gives important complementary perspective to some of the things we're discussing.
Thank you. Before I do that, I want to follow up with what Kelly was saying. I think as a person working in university, students or faculty members, especially when we reach out to the community, it's very important to gather knowledge of these elderly. They have this vast knowledge about their culture, their stories, and those they are willing to share. And when they share it, they are so happy too. As a part of our NSF grant, we work on Zautung and Matu languages here in the States. And we found out that one lady in Maryland, she knew 36 stories about her traditional folktales. And I don't know that much. I'm a linguist. I am supposed to know that. And so, wow. So I think that recording that kind of knowledge and finding out that kind of thing is very valuable, not just to the community, but also the universities and the knowledge for humanities. And so I think that also is part of our responsibility. So as a practical matter, I'm a translator. I'm a certified court interpreter for US Immigration Court. And I find it very challenging that a lot of our youths are not following that because it's hard. If you deal with courts, that's a very hard. But without court interpreters, U.S. system is such a way that these cases are kind of like, clock up. They need to, continue, whether they're guilty or not guilty or whatsoever. We have a lot of medical interpreters, many other interpreters, but court interpreters is very hard, but I think our youth need to also follow that in some fashion because it gives us a really bad name. So, yeah, I think that that's one challenge I find. And as a full-time teacher now, I don't really have a lot of time to follow on that. So.
Can I say just one more thing? I appreciate that you brought up the elders. I think there's something really powerful in elders sharing their stories and sharing their knowledge, right? And in many cases, if an elder person is resettled as part of a family and their children are of working age, they often are charged with childcare and are very isolated. And it goes back to the idea of isolation and bringing in elders to share their knowledge and share their stories really can help with their well-being. And there's a lot of research in linguistics on indigenous populations and working on their heritage languages and the improvement of overall community well-being and both mental and physical health. And that's anecdotally, that is a lot of what we see in our communities when we work with their youth and with their elders on their language.
It goes back to that notion of conservation versus
Yes.
preservation, the idea of like, oh, we find someone that has 96 stories, we can write those down and we can transcribe them. But instead, how about the context where these stories are told and shared? And then when we're using conservation rather than preservation, they can continue to evolve and take on new meaning and find new purpose and new context. And so it needs to be dynamic.
And I want to connect back to there was a conversation about connection. How do we, we are doing a certain type of scholarship. How do we help foster connection between humans? So I think that, what I have heard from our students a lot is, there's a feeling of invisibility. There are so many Chin languages and cultures in Indiana, and there are so many Hoosiers who do not know that there are Chin people here. And linguistics is not necessarily, we don't have a strong tradition of being a public-facing discipline. But Ken and I have worked really closely with John, who is a folklorist and who does have a strong training and background and history of doing public-facing scholarship. And by working together, we can make sure that we're really trying to do justice to the complexity of the linguistic issues, right? I mean, someone might come to an emergency room in Indianapolis, wait 4 hours for a Burmese translator, but they don't speak Burmese, right? It could be one of 50 Chin languages, but it's not Burmese. So there's a role for us. We have to play this role, but then we have to work really closely with people like John to do things like create public-facing exhibits, because that's how you actually foster connection. If somebody hears me say, 50 languages, they might be like, cool. But if they see a video of someone weaving this basket, then they become interested in that basketry and how amazing it is that those things that tie a palette together that seem like garbage, in fact aren't garbage, are really a valuable resource that can be repurposed because the original materials aren't available here, et cetera. So this sort of collaboration is really crucial.
And we can't lose sight of the fact, too, that when we pay attention to something, because we're at the university, that all of a sudden it causes other people to say, hey, why is this guy? I remember showing up at this backstrap weaver's home. I asked her how, Pianki, I said, how often do you get to weave? And she goes, every day. I go, oh, you get to weave every day? How long? And so every day. She was weaving all day long. The parents go to work, the children go to school, and the grandparents are stuck at home alone. And she was just weaving nonstop. And so it's this idea of bringing these resources together that we can show attention. But anyway, I'm there in her living room talking with her, and her grandson comes home. And there's this big fat white guy sitting in the living room, and it's like, who are you? Why are you here? I'm here to talk with your grandmother. My grandmother? And just couldn't believe that I was actually interested in that. And Sui was telling me that once we started exhibiting the baskets and doing programs with the baskets, now you start seeing baskets that are on the stages at community celebrations. They're hanging in people's homes. They've taken on new significance because we bring attention. Language takes on new significance because we tell people those languages matter. It takes us doing it. I get money from the National Endowment for the Arts. I get money from the Indiana Arts Commission. I should be making sure that those funds are spread both equitably and also where they need to be spent. And I see that the Chin is one of the places that we can do that.
Thank you. So I want to make sure we have time for a few questions. So who has a question for our panelists? There in the front.
Serafin, right here. Right here, right here.
Thank you. I'm Beth Samuelson. I direct the African Studies program, but I'm also in the School of Education and Literacy Studies. And I've been working with a small group of students, mainly graduate students, looking at how we can encourage and build a cadre of people who are authors, translators, illustrators, funders, boosters for creating literacy titles, reading materials, juvenile titles for children in their own languages. There's a project in Africa, in Johannesburg, called the African Storybook, and their motto is 100 books for every child in their own language. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen or how you've been involved in developing materials for children. And they could be, you know, the stories. The stories can be provided in titles that are appropriate for children, sort of helping them to remain connected to their families and their communities and their cultures. But so we just see this as a way to, like how can we go about doing this? And I'm just really curious to hear what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. I'll start us off. I'll just say one of the communities that I worked with was interested in compiling a storybook for children. But as we started working on the project, it became clear that there was not enough interest to carry forward with the project in the community, and there was only one person who could be our storyteller. He was the person that we worked with. And what I tried to do was to then connect him with our creative writers, creative writing students who were advanced students already, and with illustrators to illustrate the stories. And it turned out to be that there was more of a language gap between, like his language proficiency in English was such that when we tried to translate the story into English, it just ended up, the community wanted a bilingual book, right? The children didn't have literacy in their language, and they wanted the stories to last, right? So it was more than just the stories spoken in the language. It ended up just not working out very well because when we took a sample story to the community, they said that's not how the story goes, right? And it ended up being almost contentious, and so we withdrew. We said, okay, well, if you decide you want to work on this again, we can give it another chance. And the person ended up moving away, right? So it was a resource issue, right? We didn't have the right resource from the community to actually be able to carry forward that project. But it also taught us a really important lesson, which was to make sure that we are in constant communication with the whole community, not just with a single storyteller, because we could have published an entire book of stories that didn't quite jive with the community and weren't the collective memory of the community I'll just leave it at that.
So when language is healthy, we get to use it in all the ways that we need to. We can laugh in it, we can joke in it, we can cry, we can grieve, we can tell traditional stories, but we can also make up new stories. And so one of the things in the Chin community, again, highly multilingual, please see our posters if you didn't before, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And follow them on social media.
Follow us on social media. What's tricky is that there are dozens and dozens of languages, and there are lingua francas, and there is a strong literacy tradition in one of the lingua francas, Hakalai, but there are orthographies for lots of the other languages, but not strong literacy traditions. And so there are big efforts in some of the communities to increase literacy, but in others it just is not important. And so if we think about stories as only being traditional or only being books, then we end up in really tricky territory. Our students are the ones who had the idea that we should start making YouTube videos. And so we make YouTube videos in 9 languages at this point, and we've just added 2 more languages to our team. My team members speak about 12 languages between them. Some of those, they are comfortable reading and writing, others are not. And so we have just had to develop this sort of, sorry, permission structure is like in my brain right now. We have had to just really work hard to together build an environment where it's like, okay, if literacy is the community objective in that language, we're gonna include writing in our video, and maybe we're gonna publish a book. If literacy is not an objective, there's not gonna be writing, there's gonna be just the audio. And so we've just had to think creatively about what does it mean to build stories, but it's super clear that this is really important. And so, yeah, we're making all sorts of things. Please check them out. Yeah, in the front.
Thank you. Thank you for very interesting ideas sharing this panel. Yes, I'm a Quechua speaker from Peru. I've been working with my language for more than 30 years in language revitalization, language documentation, lexic dictionary development. And I think that's very important, not just to documentation has to go hand in hand with language revitalization, even language reclamation, preservation, development, maintenance, so to avoid that language shift. And I think technology is a wonderful resource to utilize to promote indigenous languages in their respective places and also in the diaspora, in different countries, like in the United States. For example, there are more than there are more than 37 universities where Quechua is taught now, because there are a community of immigrants living in New York, in Chicago, etc., working closely to develop the different varieties of the Quechua language. There are more than 25 different varieties. So yes, when we talk about documentation, it's a long process, documenting for how, where, how we're gonna use, how to use it. So it's not just developing the literacy, the writing system, the graphization, but also the application is very important. So I just wanna, more than a question, this is a calm comment, and thank you very much for sharing your insightful ideas.
Thank you, Serafin. And can I just say something
Say
about
it,
that?
I want to have a comment.
I think, you know, I agree 100% with what you were saying, and I think another aspect of working in the diaspora, and especially with displaced communities, is the fact that the entire population that speaks the language is in the diaspora, right? And so a lot of the work that we do as linguists within our field is making it acceptable, not just acceptable, but making it a common practice to work in the diaspora with these living languages that are evolving, that are being reshaped by the youth, to document what is happening to the language now, not just the way that it was when everybody was back home, and really validating that as a practice in the field of language documentation and conservation. It really, there is now a shift, and in fact our our large international conference that's taking place this coming spring, the theme is working in the diaspora, and that's very new. And it used to be just sort of poo-pooed. When I started working with resettled refugees, I was told, yeah, but that's not real field linguistics. And so that's a real benefit to all of us to be able to do this work and to have it be validated in our own discipline so that we are able to maintain our jobs, so that we're able to continue the work, the important work that we're able to do with the students and with the speakers.
Thank you. Other question there in the back?
Oh, Martha Nikes in Literacy, Language, and Culture in the School of Education. One of the issues, and I really, really commend all of you for really focusing on youth as one of the primary areas where language is both consolidated, forgotten, revitalized, etc. And I'm thinking very specifically, also as a child of immigrants myself, wondering why the heck we have to speak this language, or even, that none of my friends even understand where I come from, never heard of my language, etc. Really addressing what I often call the blind spot of around third grade, and the socialization that happens, and of course the hegemony that English and peers and peer group has in conveying the probably, how should I say, the uselessness of another language, etc. And thinking about how to bridge that both cognitively, appealing to a logic, if you will, as well as through other kinds of things, because culture doesn't automatically get valued. Certain aspects of it, who cares about the elders, etc. So there are those kinds of pushes and pulls among youth, and it's just something that I'm hoping will be, focused in on more. So thank you very much.
Can I just add one thing? There is this thing where we focus on the youth, but also there's a strong desire among older adults to put a piece of themselves into the future, this idea of generativity, of wanting to make sure something passes on. And we can look at how it affects youth being disconnected from a language, but also how it affects elders not being able to transmit those things that they value. I remember a friend of mine, some of y'all may know James Yan, who lived here in Bloomington, did Chinese calligraphy and stuff. He wrote his whole memoir in Chinese. He could have written it just as easily in English, but he wanted to make his children Chinese. He wanted to read Mandarin. It was very purposeful that he felt like he needed them to do that. He needed to feel like he was passing that on to them. And I see this over and over and over again.
Well, and if I can comment on the blind spot piece, I really appreciate having that vocabulary as a non-educator or as a non-K-12 educator. And you mentioned third grade being the sort of the time the frail time for folks to, for children to switch over to the peer group. And I think for many in our resettlement communities who are multilingual, that shift happens a lot earlier. And it actually begins with the parents making a conscientious decision to use a lingua franca in the home so that they're able to communicate with a larger number of community members that is near them, right? So using, in many cases, the languages that were used in the refugee camps so that those are the languages spoken by a larger part of the community in the diaspora. And I think that language loss is actually, it happens much earlier on in those communities, unless there are elders in the home. If there are 3 generations in the home, that actually changes the demographic. But one of our consultants that we worked with on one of our dictionary projects, our collaborator, sorry, he never spoke his language at home with his kids. And so when we first met his 5-year-old son, he was speaking with him in Swahili. And we asked, how come you're not speaking with him in your language? And he said, well, he doesn't speak that language. And it only clicked then to him, that he realized, oh, that's because I never spoke the language to him. And that there was a shift there, right?
There's a student back there.
Oh, student, yes, in the back.
My name is Blason of the Mon people of coastal Southeast Asia. Now, as someone who's young and an American-born student of linguistics, undergraduate, actually very early on, how do I begin to use my unique role to advocate for and empower like my people? Not just through documentation of our like very rich and ancient indigeneity, but more importantly, revitalization amongst the youth. And as someone who's young, for a language with very little institutional support.
That's a great question, thank you.
I'll start by saying I, at a sociolinguistics conference maybe 5 years ago, I heard a very famous sociolinguist, John Rickford, say, sometimes when students start feeling the urge to do practical work immediately, they think they'll abandon the degree and they'll go do the work. But the degree is how you get, or the course of study, it doesn't have to be a degree, is how you get the tools that you're going to use to let you do the work that you want to do. So you are already taking that very first step. And being at a conference like this and listening to, there are people who you've heard on the stage who probably you thought, I like what I'm hearing, I can imagine myself talking to that person. So then email that person, talk to that person, find the other people who are doing the kind of work that you want to do. Your work is going to be unique to you, but you are not alone. There is a vast network of people. Serafin just told us that he's been doing this work for 30 years. And there are people who have so much experience and so much expertise, and it's not going to be exactly the same as the challenge that you have. But I think that I'm rambling, but my number one, the thing that I'm trying to say is you build networks. You find the people who are going to be your reliable, faithful helpmates, and you do the schooling that you need to learn the tools that you're going to use, but you also just continually build that network, because there will be times when it feels very disheartening and you're going to need your network to buoy you up and to remind you that it's really important and to point out to you the things that you have achieved. And there are going to be other times when you're on the top of the world because something worked really well, and they're going to be able to celebrate with you. So I think, I know those are not practical actions, but build that network. And email me again, because I know I owe you a response.
Well, I was just going to say, leverage the networks that you make here, because I happen to know a few linguists who are working with students who are also Hmong, and so yes, let's connect.
Yeah,
for sure.
We have time for one more.
right here.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And I'm going to keep my question very short. I think one of the things with migration and immigration and refugees, both in the US and Europe, we are seeing the cultural war, right? On the one hand, we would like the second and third generation to be empowered, to keep their identity, to keep their language. On the other hand, the native born are saying you need to assimilate. And the idea of multiculturalism worked in theory, but not in practice. So how do we find that balance, right? That people value immigrants and their culture and identity and so on, without making the other side feel that they are losing their culture, they are losing their identity by celebrating multiculturalism. Thank you.
I'll start us off really quickly by saying that it's not just the communities around us, right? It's also policy, and it's also our government. The mission of the US Office of Refugee Resettlement used to be integration, right? To integrate them. And integration, as linguists, we know it means become part of the fiber, right? Weave into the fiber of the society. And during the last administration, the wording, not the the previous administration, the wording was changed to assimilation. So very clearly saying, you must become one of us. And so I think that's also important, right? The wording that is used by the administration to say what the purpose is of resettling forced migrants.
And just this whole idea of like pushing back against homogeneity is really important, because it's not just always about the other. You know, when we do our apprenticeship program or our heritage fellowship programs, you know, like I said, we've got hoopnet makers and old-time fiddlers and banjo players and mariachi dancers, and we have Chinese lion dance performers. We have all of it there, and it's like multiculturalism doesn't just have to be this. It's the idea of all of us need to have culture. All of us are better when we have these things that connect us with family and community, and that's valuable. And I think when people have that in their own lives, then they value and they see it in other people's lives. And then I always point out, whenever I do our big heritage fellowship and our apprenticeship program, I bring these people from all around the state who've been teaching people in their families and their communities to do these practices. And I tell them, I say, you're never going to see the fruits of your labor, really. You're planting these seeds that may lay dormant for 20 or 30 years. And then somebody is going to say, you know, my grandfather used to make these baskets, and he showed me a little bit about how to do this. And now, there's probably been all types of cultural suppression that has happened, all types of cultural loss that's happened around that. But all of that also gets added to. It's emergent and it's dynamic. It contracts, it grows, and then it takes on whole new meanings. I'm thinking about this idea of cultural revitalization. Often it starts with tradition, and then tradition leads to revival after some loss, and then revival then grows into this revitalization, and there's new value and new importance to it. So that's the whole reason I do what I do, is just planting little seeds in communities.
And can I just thank you for organizing this symposium. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think that the question is more important. And I think that what we're doing right here, I am only trained in what I'm trained in. I'm one human, and I will never be able to do all the work that I want to do. What I will be able to do by attending events like this and by encouraging my students to come to events like this is build better networks myself. And I was listening to the policymakers, the people who are scholars of policy yesterday and today, and just thinking about all of the things that I don't know, and thinking about all of the conversations that I'm going to have after having been here and learning from all of you. So maybe maybe it's just through conversation we keep asking that question and trying to figure it out.
That is a very nice note to wrap up our conference on. Let's thank this panel for sharing their work and insights. When Heather and I were discussing how to structure the symposium, we wanted to end with this topic in this panel for a few reasons. One is because it spotlights the role of a university engaging on these topics, not only through research, but through community engagement. And secondly, as has come up in some of the most recent questions, we wanted to end with a thought on how do we carry this forward? And part of it, of course, is the conversation, learning from each other's perspectives, and part of it is rolling up our sleeves and getting out there and engaging with people. And we hope that you're inspired by the events of the past day and a half to do that in the classroom, if you're a student here, off campus, to engage, to learn, to form those sort of communities amongst yourselves and with those who you work with, so that we build on the experience that we've shared together here. Lastly, I want to thank once more Heather, Ethan, all of the staff who have worked to put together the symposium. I hope you'll and I also, of course, am grateful to all of those of you who came from around the country to share your expert insights with us and perspectives. Let me just say to those of you who are local, we have many more great events coming at the Hamilton Luger School. One of the big events we have coming very soon that's related to today's theme is the conference that Seraphin has led and organized for the Global Indigenous Studies Network that will be here November 15th to 17th. I hope that many of you will be able to attend. Further down the line, of course, we have America's Role in the World coming in the spring, and in between, lots of other opportunities to engage on these and related topics. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of this beautiful autumn day, and we appreciate you spending this day and a half with us.